Young-Sen Park is Executive Director of the American Law Center at Korea University Law School and also Executive Director of OpenNet. Sunny Park is a former General Counsel for Microsoft Asia Pacific and is now Senior Foreign Counsel at Kim Chang. And David Tang is Managing Partner for Asia for the K&L Gates law firm. He is based now in Hong Kong and is well known to many of you. I also want to introduce Betsy Anderson, on my left, who's Executive Director of the World Justice Project and an important voice on the issues we're going to talk about today in the rule of law. We're going to start out with a brief overview of the fake news versus free expression dilemma by Srirak. So that will sort of set the stage for our discussion for later. And as we get into all of this, be thinking of questions that you might want to ask our panelists or for the group to discuss as we go along. So Srirak.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. Everyone can hear me okay? Well, it's an honor to be able to join this special session on regulating fake news and protecting freedom of expression, but at the same time building in information ecology system in the 21st century. Obviously, we are dealing with a multifaceted issue around disinformation and regulations that come along with it. At the same time, with the prospect of defending fundamental rights at the same time. But let me start by introducing giving a few words about the World Justice Project. Some of you may know the World Justice Project is an organization that reviews the Rule of Law Index, now cover 140 countries. In the past 5 years, we have found that rule of law have been declining continuously, 5 years in a row. And one of the major downfalls has been fundamental rights, or factor 4, as well as the factor number 1 on constraints on government power and civil justice. And you can find out more information about the index from our website. The new report will also be launched in about 2 weeks on the 25th of October, so we're invited to join us online at the launch. We will see if this year will be 6 years in a row or not, or we will actually make a turnaround on the rule of law index. This fall basically means there's a global trend of authoritarianism, the use of power with limited constraints in many parts of the world. The number of countries that have declining the rule of law scores in decline is growing more than the countries that have been improving. Now, just a few words about why WJP engaged on disinformation. And it's clearly disinformation poses significant threats to the democratic process, to human rights, and social fulfillment. In Asia Pacific, we conducted consultations with over 50 organizations and individuals, asking very simple questions. What do you see as the major threats to the law in Asia Pacific? And the top 3 answers include disinformation. The other 2 are access to justice for minorities, as well as access to justice to minorities. And the other one, I think, judicial independence. Sorry, that one I think. Judicial independence. We are working on these 3 major themes. Getting ourselves involved in disinformation, and WJP's aim to contribute to the development of evidence-based policy and practices and protect the very fundamental principle of justice, transparency, and accountability. We recently, only 10 days ago, organized an Asia Pacific expert meeting on disinformation regulation and the free flow of information with the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, K&L Gates, and and LexisNexis, with the support of Microsoft Illuminate Association. At this meeting, we've been informed by research covering a review of disinformation regulations in 10 countries in Southeast Asia, that's been led by Ken Elgate and David Tang, joining us on the panel. I look forward to hearing more insights on this. The meeting gave us a sense of where things stand when it comes to disinformation regulation in our region. It also shed some light of where we can and how we can go going forward from this point. The negative impacts of disinformation has been growing, and we continue to see these trends over the years, especially now with the AI been increasingly expand in so many aspects of the work. We're likely to see an increasing level of knowledge. Let me start by sharing 5 observations of the recent developments that we've informed and look forward to discuss more. The very first one is a challenge around the vagueness of disinformation definition. One of the formidable challenges around this area, what constitutes fake news or disinformation is often subjective and varies from context to context. The vagueness can also lead to unintended consequences when crafting regulation measures. Striking the right balance here will necessitate precise definition and nuanced approach. Secondly, it's important to make distinction between restricting speech and criminalizing speech. And we certainly stand at the crossroads where urgent needs to curb disinformation must be balanced between protecting rights and free speech. It's imperative to recognize the importance of the distinction of not equating criminalizing speech and restriction. And we must explore measures to effectively combat the spread of false information while upholding principles of open discourse and democratic values. Striking this balance is paramount to ensuring that our society remain vibrant. Earlier, a few words on the technology and disinformation challenges. So, the technology can facilitate, accelerate the spread of disinformation. They also can provide tools to combat it. And I think the powerful tools of artificial intelligence has driven home as never before, presenting a new challenge and opportunity for both users and regulators. A principal challenge is to employ these tools in a manner that address social harm, disinformation, while safeguarding free speech. And I should emphasize the words of social harm because this will be a key word in restricting, and colleagues will be discussing this further. Government actions have taken different approaches. We have seen many reports coming out on regulating social media platforms, ranging from exemption liability, such as in the US, and going to posting removal content. In Asia Pacific, authorities often exercise significant discretion in ways that are susceptible to abuse and law. Fourthly, tackling disinformation requires a multifaceted approach. We must offer digital literacy, empowering individuals to critically evaluate the information they encounter online. Fact-checking initiatives play a vital role in this regard. And integrated solutions involve not only regulatory measures, but also active engagement with the public to help them distinguish between fact and fiction. This is only through education and awareness that we can truly fortify information ecosystem. Finally, it's essential to emphasize the significance of collaborative efforts to navigate these treacherous waters. Successfully, we need a multi-stakeholder policy dialogue that sustains not only one-off policy dialogue. Governments, tech companies, civil society, journalists, citizens, fact-checking agencies must come together to forge common ground. In this dialogue, we can identify emerging standards, best practices that promote transparency, accountability, and improvement of the democratic ideal. In conclusion, the challenges posed by disinformation are undeniable and the consequences are severe. However, by addressing negative impacts of disinformation, defining definitions, and implementing balance, integrated solutions to foster healthier information ecosystem for the decades to come. I look forward to thoughtful discussions and shared insights. Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. You really set the table here, and many of the issues that you raised, we're going to come back to now in detail. David, I know you have focused, you and your firm both have focused on different disinformation issues, and I have several detailed questions for you in a few minutes. But let's go back to the definitional question. How is disinformation defined for purposes of our discussion here today?
Thanks, Jim. So, as Chirag said, it's very elusive and heterogeneous, so to speak, in terms of how people are approaching it. But in terms of in the academic literature, the formulation has had three components. First is whether the statement is true or false, obviously, or it could be disinformation. Second, that there is intent, that this was an intentional statement as opposed to simply forwarding on a tweet or forwarding on an email of some kind. And third, that harm is caused, that there's some causal link in harm is caused. Now, having said that, clearly there are criticisms of all three components. Does a statement really need to be true or false in order to be a matter of disinformation or a comment that causes harm? And now we're talking about the internet space here, right? And so to give you an example, I think Professor Park used the example of the comment, "All lives matter." For those from the United States, you know that a couple of years ago there was the slogan, "Black Lives Matter." But if you then use the comment, "All lives matter," is that going to cause harm at some point if taken not in the right context? Well, in many cases, that is not a true or false statement necessarily, but could be causing harm in the context. The intentionality is also has some heated criticism behind it, as lawyers in the room know. Mens rea, the notion of intention, is normally associated with criminal law, and so the question is, should this be a matter of criminal law? Is mens rea really required? Also remember the context that we're in. Most of the comments, I shouldn't say most, but a good portion of the comments made that would be considered disinformation are not made by human beings, right? These are chatbots. These are computers that have been programmed, state-sponsored disinformation that's spewing out into cyberspace. And so how do you impute intent to an algorithm? How do you impute intent to a computer for those purposes? And then Chirag also pointed to the whole issue of harm, social harm versus individual harm. It's not necessarily a defamatory comment on an individual, but it is a social harm in terms of creating false impressions, particularly in a sensitive area like elections. We were just talking a few minutes beforehand in the current Israeli-Hamas situation. We know that there are lots of videos being posted online that are taken from video games, of all things, and purporting to be videos of actual battles that are taking place. What's the harm there? It's that incremental step-by-step harm where you're putting layer upon layer of false information out there to be consumed by the public. So, sorry for a long-winded response, just to get those three elements out there.
Very important. Professor Park, there are laws criminalizing disinformation. What international human rights standards apply to those laws?
So, international human rights standard has been already established beyond debate decades ago, that speech cannot be criminalized simply for being false. It has to cause harm, specific harms, and restriction of it has to be, if you are in Europe, necessary for a democratic society. So under that, we have for striking down what we call false news crimes. In Canada, from 80s, the highest courts of Zimbabwe, even Antigua Barbuda, these cases all came in 90s and 2000. And most latest, Korean Constitutional Court struck it down in 2010. The reasons are that punishing somebody for falsity will only delay the advent of truth, because a lot of times we are living with incomplete information. We make decisions based on incomplete science, and trying to punish somebody for that inaccuracy will only dissuade or deter people from pursuing the truth. A few years ago, people who believe the earth is flat, they had their World Conference right in Seoul. Now, that didn't cause any harm. There was no police involvement. It didn't cause any problem for Korean society. The second reason is, this is what the Canadian Supreme Court said in the case of Zunda back in 1983. Exaggeration sometimes serves important civic values. Environmental activists can exaggerate the impact of environmental harms in the local societies. So maybe we need some of this for a democratic society. The third reason, I think this is the most important reason, that criminalization of false speech or criminalization of false news has been so much abused by authoritarian governments to put down, to suppress rather truthful critics of their regimes. So if you look at the governments that have have used false news crimes, majority of them are authoritarian governments. In Korea, back in I show you the creative depth of how authoritarian governments use this. Back in 1960, when the military junta took power by coup d'etat, they changed the constitution. They changed the constitution so that the president can pass laws without legislature. Guess what the first law that the president passed? It's called Emergency Decree Number 1, and it banned fake news about the new constitution. And guess how that law was used? So many people, like millions of people, were jailed for criticizing the new constitution. And this is not just part of the past. Just in the time of pandemic, the Malaysian government declared a state of emergency that again gave extraordinary power of legislation to the prime minister. And ironically, the name of the first law that the prime minister passed was again named Emergency Decree Number 1. And guess what it banned? It banned fake news about the emergency, about the state of emergency, and how the government was reacting to that. This shows, past, present, the room for abuse by the authoritarian government is just too broad. So, I want to thank David, how much we went in to really figure out the working definition, and it was a futile effort. And because it's futile, it will be abused by the authoritarian government. And so the next kind of a trend is, instead of criminalizing it, taking down, just restricting speech. But we're going to talk about international human rights standards on that when James gives me the chance to speak again. I'll stop here for a second.
Good, thank you. Sonny, you're no longer with Microsoft, but your experience there, I think, really would be of interest to our group. How has Microsoft complied with fake news regulations and what are the challenges that you face there, the Microsoft folks?
Yeah, thank you. So I think everything that my other panelists have said, imagine how that applies to a company who wants to operate a global business. Definition, first and most, has been very, very challenging. In those countries where they have a fake law regulation, the definition in itself is very, very vague. So the same thing, whether or not something is true or is not true, and many times is not that simple. It isn't as simple as sun is here. And many times it's many shades of gray, at least more than 50, I believe. So it's understanding the definition. And then in many times, I think the intent is not there as well. So although Microsoft, we don't have a social media platform, but we do have consumer products, as well as we worry about the enterprise space. Media companies, academics, research institutions, they use our products and we want to ensure that they get protected just as well as anybody else who's putting out their opinion on the internet. So one of the ways that we've been trying to, I guess, combat or to comply with these challenges is, one is we try to sort of recognize what is that we can do as Microsoft in providing the right kind of tool. Is one sort of aspect of it. Second aspect of it is really, it really needs a multilateral stakeholder involvement. It needs a public-private sort of partnership in order to combat this, and this is something that we can do alone. The third part that we've done in trying to sort of tackle these challenges, engaging really directly with the government and just letting them know the inadvertent sort of the residual challenges that they have if they have a very restrictive definition of a certain law, or if they want to be too expansive in leveraging the existing laws. Cyber Crime Act or the Magistrate Law of Thailand. Those are not really fake laws per se, but those have been sort of leveraged in order to silence political dissent. And what we try to do is, especially me personally, is just really going and engaging with the government, and we can't say that's wrong, but we also try to highlight sort of what is the negative consequence or the impact they can have on all of these countries who are really focused on sort of digital economy. And what is that going to do to you in your country if you try to silence one thing, where it could have a ripple effect on something much, much more significant?
Srirak or any of the rest of you who might want to jump in on this. I have a journalistic question. Traditionally, journalists have tried to simply report on events or on candidate statements, in a presidential race or some other campaign, and have refused to go further, to editorialize about what the comment is or whether it's true or not. But let's consider today's world. Just hypothetically, of course. What if there is a candidate for an important office who seems to lie about everything? Who lies about who won an election, who lies about the size of his crowds at an event, who might even lie about the size of his hands. One can't. What is that? How should journalists respond to that? Is simply reporting what the candidate says and leaving it at that enough, or are there additional steps that a journalist ought to take looking at that hypothetical sort of situation?
Yes, thank you very much. It's really hard to tell who that person might be. I would say there will be two parts to this, and this is a good test of the truth. There will be a part that there is a lie, and you need to make sure that the majority of the population know it's a lie. You will not be able to tell everybody, and not the whole population will agree with you. That's very obvious. But that's a part of a digital literacy role, the understanding, the ability to use judgment to some extent, to separate between what is true and not true, and whether that's disinformation or not. So that's the part, is the line you need to live with. That means there will be disinformation on your mobile phone, on your screen, many of them, and likely to be increasing, that you need to accept that it will come to you. You can't remove all of it. That's a very basic fact. The other part is to monitor when there's social harms, as David mentioned. Then that's when the authority needs to take action. And taking action here refers to restrict rather than criminalize as a principle in terms of going forward. The more serious you apply human rights principle, the more likely you will see this amount of disinformation spread. Because under international human rights law, then only 5 or 6 types of messaging or speeches that are prohibited under international laws, and propaganda of war, incitement of violence, anything that will harm public health, national security, the usual orderings will be very limited. So any lies by any candidate may not fit that 5 or 6 definition. So we just need to live with it. And the more we can actually get the society to be aware of it, use our judgment, I think that would be the better.
Please.
I think, James, your question is right on the money, because, I mean, journalists are not governments. Journalists are not parties to the international human rights treaties. So they can exercise their journalistic judgment, editorial judgment, and propagating some information and not propagating others, and also editorializing on the things that they are reporting on. They don't need to act like governments. They don't need to check, whether this information by the candidate, fits the legal requirements of disinformation or hate speech. The journalists working for private news companies have a freedom to, just shun some of the speech. But on that particular example, I think journalists, many journalists will think that they need to report the fact that this candidate has made these false accusations, and that is something that public have right to know.
Right.
As I think Svira already mentioned it, when it comes to platforms, so the journalists, I think, have to, editorialize, has to add context, add rebuttals, show the other side of the story, fact checking, which leaves us, which gives us, which obligates us to talk about the role of platforms, because the platforms don't have freedom to do all that. They cannot editorialize, they cannot, do fact check, and then, send out like nicely fact check article. So platforms have to do more, kind of, in the way of what journalists are doing to monitor the social harms coming from the candidate's speech. And in doing so, I think it's important to look at, I think I already said this, not to silo the moderation categories, like hate speech, checkboxes, disinformation checkboxes. Instead of doing that, platforms also have to look at the total harms coming from the speech, not just hold on to the truth value or lack thereof of the report, and should not be bogged down by the international human rights treaties. If at all, they should be bound to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which is becoming part of national anti-trafficking rights law as well, which does not require them to do anything with a specific company, but to do due diligence on their overall behavior, which makes me talk about how the moderation should be less like content by content, should be done in a broad kind of contextual analysis. So that candidate one statement should not be analyzed alone. It should be read together with other statements to see whether it's becoming a campaign that really materializes on that one campaign.
One aspect of, I'm sorry.
Please, go ahead.
One other aspect of your question, Jim, is that I think you're assuming that the journalist is a journalist for the New York Times or the Financial Times, where you have an editor, where you have a set of ethics, where you have a clear line or a fairly clear line between journalism, fact reporting versus opinion. But of course, when we're talking about the online space, everyone's a journalist. Everyone who posts becomes a journalist, reporting on what they allegedly are seeing. So I think it's much more difficult to make some of the judgment calls, because the person who posts is the reporter, is the editor, is the person who may or may not have a set of ethics that they follow. And so this comes to the digital literacy that Shrek mentioned. It comes to a lot of the other fact-checking, other issues that we'll be talking about in terms of how to control, how to regulate this particular space. One example on elections, you can say elections is Tuesday, November 2nd, or you can say elections occur Wednesday, November 3rd. That's clearly true or false statement. But we can also have a reporter saying, boy, the lines are really long to go to the voting booth. It's going to take 6 hours for you to be able to vote. Well, maybe there's only 3 people in line. And in that situation, it makes a huge difference on whether people are going to turn out to vote or not. So I think it's going to depend on how you talk about the journalists as well.
Absolutely.
Can I just
Please.
add one thing to this? Is interesting. So Microsoft commissioned a research done a couple of years ago, I think, but now it's a couple of years. Anyway, what they found is in those areas, and this is just in the U.S., so this wasn't global, but just in the U.S., in those pockets of the regions or districts or states where they have less sort of credible news media, there was a tendency for much higher fake news to roam around the internet. So it is very, very important that credible news media like New York Times, or whether we like them or not like them, if that is available, then people tend to have more, I guess, a balanced approach to looking at news. But in some of the sort of regional areas or rural areas of the United States where they may not be the case, or if the regional newspaper is not around, then they opt for more internet. And in those areas, we found that there was a significant increase in fake news and people relying on fake news.
At least in the United States, over the last 6 or 7 years, this has been a major area of change. Reporters have seen the need, whether at a major TV network or a reputable newspaper, to say, candidate said X, there is no evidence that X is true. To add that extra statement. That is, I think, a major development, at least in U.S. journalism at the reputable level, and I think that's important for citizens to be able to have that information if they don't otherwise have it. Dave, let's move back to you. Along the legal regulatory spectrum, how have states attempted to regulate disinformation, particularly in Southeast Asia?
So we did do a study of the ASEAN countries, and it was amazing the variety of approaches that were taken in trying to control this disinformation. I'm a U.S. lawyer, so coming from the U.S. in terms of U.S. laws, Bill of Rights, values. It was even more interesting because, of course, in the U.S., people talk about the First Amendment and freedom of expression as being paramount. And in places like Southeast Asia, there are other paramount values. People often refer to the 3 R's: race, religion, and in some countries, royalty. So you will have regulations that, just based on topics, are simply forbidden to be talked about. Race, religion, for the sake of social harmony, because those are such sensitive issues in Southeast Asia. You can do it. But even in, for instance, in Europe, Germany prohibits any mention of the Holocaust for fear of it sparking negative reactions. So that is one category. Singapore is in a class of its own because they're very careful to say we don't want to censor any communications, but we want the right of rebuttal and disclosure. And it's not just anybody that has the right of rebuttal, it's only government ministers who then have the right to say, we want to rebut this particular statement, and they have the right to post whatever the rebuttal statement would be, to just make sure that the consumer of whatever is being posted has, let's say, both sides of the issue. Now, cynics would say that that only happens in a country like Singapore, where you have a very high level of competency in terms of government ministers. And cynics would say that in other countries, it is in fact government ministers that may be the greatest disseminators of disinformation. So giving them that right, it comes with some problems as well. Others will tuck in, such as Vietnam, will tuck in to their general laws, whether it's defamatory or advertising or general regulatory laws that fold into it the privacy issues, the data protection issues that come into place as well, and others will simply criminalize, which is something that we've talked about already. So there is a very wide spectrum, end-to-end, on approaches that have been taken, but it's very much geared to underlying values of what's important to those countries and what those values are. And as I say, you know, it's an interesting discussion that doesn't take place in the United States simply because of the freedom of expression through the First Amendment, and with the social media companies through Section 230 of the Federal Communications Act, where they're protected from having to take any active role on the moderation issues that Professor Park talked about. Whereas in the rest of the world, the values are different, and so therefore the regulatory approach is very different to how they look at these topics.
Following up on that theme, Professor Park, there are laws empowering administrative bodies to force platforms to take down information. What international human rights standards apply to such laws, and how about laws imposing a liability to force platforms to seek out disinformation?
Thank you. I mean, this being an Asia-Pacific conference, I think it's high time to talk about this because Indonesia, Myanmar, Vietnam, Thailand, and Singapore, all in Southeast Asia, these are the countries that recently passed a law basically repurposing and empowering their communication ministries into censorship bodies, content censorship bodies. And I mean, we talked about how criminalization is bad, but government mandated takedown of the content also violently clashes with international human rights law. We already have decisions from the highest courts of France twice, and Philippines, Spain, the US, of course, from the 1960s, and Turkey. that administrative body alone cannot act in taking down content. The reasons are the same. We talked about how criminalization of false news can be abused by the government because of the bias for the content. The same thing can happen with administrative censorship. The United States also abandoned fairness review of FCC in broadcasting. Now, broadcasting was one exceptional area. Broadcasting was the only area where administrative censorship has been accepted, not just in the U.S. but around the world, because of the special nature of how broadcasting is done. It is done to grant a state monopoly by to the broadcasters, and comes with it the public interest obligations of broadcasters. But on the internet, you just don't have that. I mean, the platforms create their own bandwidth by rate tables, etc. So administrative censorship has been very rare. When it arose, it has been struck down as unconstitutional in France, as I said, Philippines, Spain, Turkey. So, for instance, Turkey had a very comprehensive censorship. Now they are going through court decisions. And the second reason is that, these administrative decisions are subject to judicial review in most countries. And because of judicial review, the administrative decisions become provisional. And the authors of the postings will have to go through inconvenience of filing lawsuits to prove that their postings should survive, and that causes chilling effect. Of course, there are many areas of our life that administrative bodies act alone without prior judicial review, but in the domain of free speech, we have recognized the chilling effects as an unconstitutional harm, because speaking is easily chilled. Speaking is usually easily suppressed. Like eating desire, we have to eat, right? When you get sleepy, you need to sleep. But in terms, like when you need to speak, a lot of times, even a little bit of inconvenience makes you restrain yourself, and that's where our civilization cuts corners and all the colorfulness will disappear. So these are the reasons that the censorship should be refrained. And you are in Seoul, and South Korea has had a censorship for a long time, and we can see from the latest news, you can see the harm of it. Just 2 weeks ago, the South Korean government announced one strike out policy, which is that the administrative censorship. By the way, I sat on that body on the nomination of the opposition party, and so I know how politicized and biased the deliberation can be. But the government just issued a one strike out policy where they not only deliberate upon online postings, on blogs, tweets, but also will deliberate on legacy media articles and will shut down a media house even if there is one fake news produced by the media house. They haven't done it yet, but the threat of it, has already caused, one New Yorker article. It's rare that New Yorker talks about South Korea, dedicated to an article in South Korea. But you should take a look how administrative censorship can really worsen the media independence. There's not a separate reason. Also, one reason we should stay away from administrative censorship is that the censorship itself becomes part of the disinformation campaign of the governments themselves. When we talk about, talk to disinformation researchers around the world, what are they talking about? Disinformation from China, disinformation from Russia, disinformation from Myanmar. You know, there are victims with the disinformation. Taiwan, Ukraine, Rohingyas in Myanmar. You know, letting governments censor the content, online content, is like, you know, leaving the fish with the cats. So it is so you know, if you have and this comes coupled with severe liability imposed on the platforms. Instead of you know, the order doesn't go to the post, the author of the post, the posting. The order goes to platforms, and if platforms fail to take down, sometimes 1 hour, sometimes 4 hours, sometimes well, 40 minutes, reverse the order. Sometimes 1 week, sometimes you know, 4 days, sometimes 1 day, sometimes 4 hours. In case of one of the South Asian countries, within 1 hour. If they fail to take down, then they are subject to very high amounts of sanctions, or sometimes it gets blocked from that country. So I stop here, but if you have clients, you know, platforms who are blocked from one of these countries, talk to me. I'll help you file constitutional challenge.
Sure, Ryan.
Thank you. Just a few points just to quickly add to what David and Keir just mentioned. I think what would help also to understand the regulations of content takedown by social media is to separate out between, first, is the category when the government requests social media companies to take down content. So the first, the initiators coming from government. Then this is, according to international human rights law, this is subject to the restrictions of free speech. So the 5 or 6 categories that I mentioned a while ago. The request will have to justify based on that, especially if the country already ratified the international covenant on civil and political rights. When governments do that, which most countries in Asia Pacific have requested social media to take down content, most of them are related to oppositional party posts, especially during elections and so on, for political gain. Social media in practice have responded very diverse from, say, just immediately take down within the minutes, going to challenge and request governments to come up with a court order in order for content to be taken down. So there's pushback, and at the same time, there's a quick vote at the same time. So this is where a challenge that hasn't been any particular standard or even ethics or norms to address it. And this is largely absent from the review that P&L Gates have done with others. The other part of it is when social media companies take down content by themselves, and this is mainly by setting their algorithms. Each day there's hundreds of millions messages that's already been taken down, whether it's in the category of hate speech, which is companies can set it more sensitive than internet hate speech under international law of the definition. Incitements of violence, hate, and other related. So that's the part that is a bit more in the vague area because the international human rights law, Keir's mentioned the business and human rights UN principle does not go into detail of what is regulated under the ICCPR should be included by the government side. And companies use this by the community guidelines. And the leading champion, or at least innovators, has been in Europe, whether the USA law has been enforcing companies to take down content into various categories. Some categories that need to take down content within 48 hours, or they face huge fines, and the maximum fines going up to 6% of the annual income. That make Meta very worried about something in particular, and as well as the issues of disclosing transparency, sharing information. That has been a major challenge of the recent development at the same time.
I have a specific illustration for that. So in the United States, a month or so ago, the federal court said that the Biden administration could not force social media companies to take down false public health statements during COVID. So some of those statements were take bleach and you'll prevent catching COVID. Now, obviously, a public and social harm. I can't think of any other country in the world that has regulation in this area where that would have occurred, because you weigh the social harm aspect of the public health issues there to say, yes, the government ought to be able to tell social media companies, do a better job and take down the false statements because of the harm that it would cause. So I just want to point out that it's not a clear-cut case on that censorship outweighs the public health or public harm types of issues that come up when governments may ask social media companies to take down information.
Sure, but just one sentence. But a lot of times, I mean, the law, I talked about Southeast Asian countries picking up evidence of censorship, and if you look at the laws, the enabling laws, the standard of takedown, when it's done by administrative bodies, it tends to be very vague, as you found out.
Yeah.
So, for instance, sometimes postings, quote unquote, against the state are taken down. Postings inserting the state are taken down. You can see how vague and broad these tools are, and I mean, and the censorship will be always exercised in favor of the incumbent, and that's the reason FCC, even within American FCC, even within the exceptional area of broadcasting, they abandoned the fairness review back in the 80s because of this lack of impartiality in the successive censorship regimes as the president's changed.
Now, Sonny, we haven't mentioned AI really yet. How has AI been used to detect fake news? Microsoft, how did you folks deal with that?
Yeah, so I think there's an opinion that tech is the problem. And there's also an opinion that tech is a solution. I think it's probably both. Tech is neutral. I think it's whether you use it as a tool or you use it as a weapon. I think that's the challenge that we have. The areas that Microsoft is really trying to ensure a healthier sort of internet ecosystem. One area where they use AI is Microsoft has developed this thing called the Microsoft Video Authenticator. Now, especially with deep fakes, even with still picture text media, the difference is very hard to detect by human eyes. So what Microsoft has done is we use AI to come up with this authenticator, which would tell you whether or not, with confidence score, whether or not this media or this still picture has been manipulated. So we're not telling you that it's fake, but the user or somebody who's looking at the video can tell whether or not, that's for and what it means, so this must have been some manipulation. It isn't complete maybe, but there's a degree of manipulation in there. And of course, in order to understand that, it needs to be a digital literacy, go hand in hand, but that's one area where you use the AI. The other area where Microsoft has been helping and is really in coalition with other companies as well, they developed this coalition, they have formed this coalition called Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. We call it a C2PA. And one of the projects that they've been working with, I think with the New York Times and BBC, and I think with CBS, is called Project Origin. Basically what it is with AI, they're trying to put a digital watermark at the beginning for the publishers and the creators, so that from the start to where it lands, because many times, sometimes they think it's New York Times article, but it's not, but you could trace it, and the New York Times could, for instance, tell whether or not this has been tampered with through this digital watermark to let you know whether or not there's been some, whether or not it's complete fake news from the beginning or there's been some manipulation. So that is done with AI's help as well. Other area that we work with AI is Microsoft is AI for Good lab, And what they've done is they use AI to try to detect those internet sites that are state-sponsored. So we've seen a lot of traffic or a lot of sort of bombardment of activities, heavy activities coming out of Russia. There's been, I think, 6 organizations, KGB and others, where they've been planning attack on Ukraine way before the tanks rolled into the borders. And this disinformation has been implanted in the internet way before, even a year before. So Microsoft has seen really active engagement and in cyberspace even before the tanks rolled in. And that was all done through AI because it is very, very hard to track all that information with humans alone. So those are some just 3 examples alone where the AI has been used and is still helping to identify state-sponsored internet sites and then tracking it back to who the sponsors are. And we found that there are at least 6 organizations that are sponsored by Russia in order to spread propaganda, in order to lie about COVID, which we feel that was a trigger for the big demonstration that happened in New Zealand at the same time. Meanwhile, in Russia, they were saying everybody should go get COVID vaccine, but in the media, they were saying, no, you need to get it. And that somehow led to this huge demonstration in New Zealand. So you can see, and that could really be helpful. Just using the technology and AI has been very helpful for that front.
Can I ask you something?
Yes.
So when Microsoft identified those media sites that are tools of propaganda, did Microsoft share the information with them?
Of course, we
Like
do.
when was that? Like, as soon as before the tanks rolled in, or?
I don't know. Well, so, I mean, we didn't find out whether there's 6 sites before the tanks rolled in, but we did, Microsoft did find a lot of heavy activities that are targeted towards Ukraine. So even before the tanks rolled in, actually, we did engage with the Ukrainian government. And before that, and this was beyond sort of, but Ukraine's law was that there was they prohibited data transfer outside of Ukrainian borders, especially for government data. So with this information that we had, we shared with the Ukrainian government. 80% of the Ukrainian government data was transferred outside in various different countries, in Poland and other parts of sort of European countries and the NATO countries. That helped, actually, that's the reason, I mean, that's one of the reasons why Ukrainian government is still functioning, because they're able to access their data and they're able to communicate without being tampered with. And Microsoft is sort of, we couldn't do it alone. I mean, we tracked it. We worked with other tech companies as well to ensure that the governments were able to function and to able to still operate their government and their country through this effort of 80% of the data being stored in various different locations outside. So yes, we do. And we do share with actually other agencies or countries as well, not only on the Ukraine and Russia part of it, but there's been state-sponsored attack even in Korea, and so we do try to share. Whether or not they do anything about it is up to the individual or the organizations that we see.
Goes to Microsoft. This Q&A was not yours.
One of the first uses of artificial intelligence that caught my attention was a TV reporter on screen interviewing a technician with a computer there. And the technician said, well, what would you like to see on the screen? And then the guy said, well, made up something. He said, well, Bill Cosby eating spaghetti. And the technician spent 3 seconds, and on the screen was Bill Cosby eating spaghetti. He says, okay, have him eat spaghetti with his hands. Guy talked for 3 seconds, and on the screen was Bill Cosby digging into spaghetti, and all created by the computer in no time at all. One can imagine certain hypothetical candidates maybe also, never mind. David, let's go back to you for a second. We've talked about whether technology is the problem or the solution. Where do you come out on that?
So a couple of different aspects. We talked about fact checking a little bit, and I think this, everyone knows that there are tens of millions of comments spewed out on a daily basis that may be categorized as disinformation, and people have talked about AI as the grand solution to be able to pull all of that back. And as Sunny rightly pointed out, it's not either good or bad. It's a tool that can be used both ways. And AI is just as bad in spewing out a lot of disinformation as it is in trying to filter and control it. I think what it shows is that it is one of several instruments, one of several solutions in this particular area that technology can be used along with a lot of the other topics that we've talked about. So my point in raising it was simply that it's a tool that can be used for repressively, as Professor Park has talked about on the censorship side, but it can also be used proactively for social benefit. And it's just going to be a question of how it's being used.
I have one more for Professor Park, and then I'm going to open things up to questions from the audience in our last few minutes. We've talked about a number of alternatives to regulatory approaches to disinformation. Which ones of those have you seen that have worked the best and maybe have a future?
Regulatory approach is not. I think it is, internet is a product. I think the companies have a lot more duties, a lot of high-level duties that they have to carry out that government regulation cannot reach. So high that government cannot even understand. We just, heard from Microsoft how they helped with some of the most urgent topics. It is, but joking aside, I think platforms should do more. Microsoft shared the Russian disinformation with the Ukrainian government. Can Microsoft do the same with the other types of disinformation? Could Meta share disinformation by Myanmar military junta with the Rohingyas or leaders of Rohingya communities? Doing that transparency serves two purposes. One, platforms will be better informed in identifying the harmful content, because a lot of information, if you just like when you report a content, just one report goes in to the moderator, and moderators look at it and just look at the content, just look at the four corners of this one posting. That's not how this information works. It is collection of, it is an aggregate of different messages, each one of which may look innocuous, that cause the harms. For instance, Twitter's Trust and Safety Council, which is their product trust and safety department. So they work very well with the civil society, like with us. Like I go to their conference every year, and I start all the NBA, will be briefed on their new moderation guidelines. They will report on the experiment that they're doing with the new moderation guidelines, and we will give our feedback, etc. Twitter Trust and Safety Guideline used to have, one of the last guidelines before Elon Musk shut it down and changed the name was a vulnerable person guideline. It's broad, but what it was this, like in a society charged with hatred or racism and religious animosities, verbal attack of majority religious leader against human rights defender or journalist can cause not just verbal attacks but physical attacks by the trolls. So a lot of times that trigger comes not from like, hate speech written or disinformation written postings, but just the leader is tweeting the name and address of one person. And if that is submitted, if that is reported as harmful, the moderator will say, it's just name and address. It's not harmful, right? That's how things fall to the cracks. You need more nuanced feedback from the civil society who have worked with in that local area. So that's one reason. The other reason is, the other reason platform transparency is important is, especially social media companies, their 90% of income comes from advertising. Means the more people stay on their platform, the more money they can make by selling to advertisers. So the more kind of eye-catching, false or not, titles and messages they leave on their platforms, they can make more money. So there is that conflict of interest between, the journalistic integrity that we want to at least make platforms share a little bit. Conflict of interest with journalistic integrity and their monetization scheme. So to reduce the conflict of interest, there has to be more transparency on how much, how much people, how much the sources, how much those YouTube influencers, participating in this disinformation campaign are making from YouTube. And same thing with Meta, so that there is some balance between that.
I would use that as an argument to say there is a role for regulation. Because of conflicts of interest, because of integrity issues, why should the social media companies be left to their own devices to come up with their own rules when from a societal perspective, we should have that across the board. And the underlying fact is social media companies can do more. In the United States, they're not required to do more, so they don't. Whereas outside the United States, they do come to the table when governments say, if you don't do this, we're going to revoke your license to do business here. And so I think it is warranted to ask the social media companies to do more along these lines on a more standardized basis as well, so that it's not simply left to their own devices and their commercial impulses as to what they want on their platform.
I've been in support of transparency regulation. I've been in support of that since 2015.
I'm saying more than transparency.
Well, can I add something as somebody who worked for the tech company? One of the challenges that I know I face with Microsoft is governments can't differentiate between social media companies and the other tech companies. Tech is tech, and it's all grouped together, and that's the challenge that I face. And yes, I think Microsoft is one of the sort of the rare tech companies where we really do want regulation, but you shouldn't leave it up to each individual companies to be the decider of what is right or wrong or whatever. I mean, we don't want to use our discretion. People change and they change, and so we do want regulation. But at the same time, I know I've personally had many challenges talking to governments about differentiating between the social media companies and how that should be regulated, as opposed to companies like Microsoft and others where we have different type of technology. And there's always been this challenge, and I know I've worked in Indonesia and in Malaysia and in Thailand and others, where we try to really come up with some legal instrument that would ensure that there is a less of a chilling effect, and then there's less of an unfettered access to sort of customers' data by the government in trying to embed the right kind of principles. And one of the things that I worked on was called trusted cloud principle. And I don't want to go into details, but it has been very, very challenging. That's another sort of a different kind of digital literacy sort of training or education that we need to have together with the government as well.
Well, this panel this morning has resolved all of the fake news issues, so I can't imagine that you would have any questions, but in case you do, we have a few minutes. David.
There's a very quick question. I'd love to get the panelists' thoughts on whether the United States should get rid of Section 230.
It's not going to go away. It can be, I think, read down by the courts, but, or it can be amended. The international standard on the platform responsibility is that platforms should not be held liable for the contents that they are not aware of. But CDA 230 now shields platforms even for the contents that they are given clear notice of.
And that their
so-
systems are designed in order to perpetuate and publicize.
So, you know, cutting that down, cutting it back will not violate international standard.
And 230 was passed, right, in the infancy of the industry to try to promote the industry. And the circumstances are very different now as to what needs to be protected and whether the social media companies need to protect it. And I think, as Sunny just said, if you were to ask the social media companies, they probably wouldn't mind to have some regulation so that they can say, well, we comply, as opposed to a statute that simply doesn't force any real responsibility on them as well, because they're actually doing that outside the United States. You know, if they're actually doing it outside the United States, and we know they can do it, why not in the United States as well? That would be my argument.
There's a question in the back, let's do those two and then that's it. Yes, please.
Could you tell me what is your thoughts in relation to the best mix of technology, soft law, and hard law? I mean, you have respectively discussed the beneficial way to cope with the hate speech or the disinformation, but I'm not sure what is your thoughts how to mix the soft law and the technology and the hard law. And in relation to this, I'm not sure whether or not you are thinking that the EU AI Act is effective. I mean, so the EU is trying to codify some kind of act which requires, in relation to the high-risk AI, the risk monitoring system or the obligation to store the logs or something like that. And I'd like to know what you perceive the EU AI Act. In any case, what is the ideal structure, mixture of the hard law and soft law and technology?
Let's actually get all the questions out and then we'll try to answer them. Sir, and then that's it.
I was going to say, Rob, your time. You know, if you don't go to the social media companies, what's going to happen? I mean, already you've got balkanized or separated out news. People get their news from WhatsApp. In a lot of developing countries, that's where they trust it. You're going to have algorithms that use generative AI to communicate with people, and they're going to switch their message based on what engages the people to stay on the platform. You're going to have individualized news at that level, and no one else will see it. No one else is part of that conversation. The only place that the only place that occurs is in there. If it's not the social media companies, and with some requirement outside of that, we'll just never know. I mean, things will change, and they'll change at scale, and there's no visibility into it at all. So, yeah, I agree with the AI Act. I'm curious how that's going to impact it as well.
That's it.
Yeah, I want to see if I can find some space between David and KS. And thinking about the Southeast Asia context in particular, I'm wondering if the issue is not, you know, regulation versus no regulation, but really who decides. And, you know, the real problem with regulation is its abuse by the decision maker. And it really ties into the other priority for WJP in this region, which is judicial independence. And if you had real judicial independence and oversight of that regulatory action, you know, to make sure that it wasn't arbitrary and abusive, you know, wouldn't that be, and I know this is kind of pie in the sky, but I mean, isn't that really what our problem is? Not so much regulation, but the decision maker.
I agree. It's just that judicial independence is as a harder law to reach as journalistic integrity.
As a practical matter, though, the judicial process with respect to time becomes a huge problem. I mean, if you've got immediate comments out there that cause harm, how do you go through the judicial process within hours or days to be able to either take down content or to respond to content immediately?
When Philippine Supreme Court struck down their administrative censorship back in 90s, they equated content takedown as search and seizure. that it should come from warrant. And, warrants can be issued within a few hours,
Yes, yes.
and can be executed within a few hours. So I think that's.
Sure.
Thank you. I agree, and I think it's I see regulation as part of the solution. Given how order has been very new, the international system are not used to. When the UN was set up, there was no internet at the time, and now we're struggling to regulate what's going on at the moment. That's very clear. And to see now when Europe is taking the initiative and regulate, and we need to see this more than just on the content or removing hate speech, but also in the regulation, reporting, transparency, including takedown content. So there's various elements into it, including the part that we haven't talked very much, and that's the monetization on the privacy, the use of data of users. All of these are big ticket items that need to be regulated, and not only on the disinformation and content takedown. So we need to relocate the conversation that we have here. Very quickly, I just want to add on the point talked earlier about the importance of using technology, including AI, to trace the originality, the sources of this information that comes from the place. And I think the vaccines, this misinformation sources, one of the research in Europe that identified, so they come down to from less than 30 organizations that produce anti-vaccine and spread the word. What Sandy mentioned, I think that's a part of this attempt. And then disinformation in the context of armed conflict, telling stories, undermine democracy, the state-sponsored disinformation, that really come down to tracing the sources of the originality. And I think that's where the efforts to address disinformation probably should address and prioritize more.
Well, I'm afraid we need to close now. From a personal point of view, to avoid fake news and promote free expression, if you rely exclusively, at least for the Americans, on Saturday Night Live and the Stephen Colbert Show, I think you can trust the information that they're giving. Please join me in thanking our panel for a wonderful.